I want to speak on the subject of democracy and democratization. I think I will speak for only about an hour today. That will give us more time to discuss, and you can raise any question you want to, including questions from the session yesterday, if you have some of that. Feel free to take up any subject in addition to what we are talking about today. So, democracy and democratization, I think it has come back on our mental horizon, not least because of the events in the Middle East that raised hopes for a so-called fourth wave of democratization. You know, I think that in the 1990s there was a great enthusiasm on part of democracy and democratization because of the fall of the wall and the breakdown of the Soviet Empire. And in the late 1990s, one commentator said that, okay, there may be a lot of non-democratic countries out there, but it's uncool to be a dictator. It's not nice to be an autocrat. If you're a decent person in the world of the 1990s, you are democratic and you have democratic legitimacy. And I think that over the next 10 years, that turned, I think that actually turned away to the worse, in the sense that authoritarianism came back, maybe not big time, but at least many of the most optimistic hopes for a more democratic future were disappointed. And you remember perhaps that Times magazine every year recognizes someone that they call Person of the Year. And who was the Person of the Year in 2007? That was Mr. Vladimir Putin. And what did the Time magazine have to say about him? A man of steely confidence and strength. He had put Russia back on the track and things into order. And now, you know, things were going more straightly than they used to, and so on and so forth. Uncool to be a dictator? So I think only a few years ago, the mood was changing towards something else. And I think with the popular uprisings in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in many other places in the Middle East, our democratic hopes and spirits are being lifted again. And mine certainly as well. And at the same time, I cannot help to be a little more skeptic and a little more pessimistic than many of those that now talk about a new rosy democratic future for almost all countries in the world, which is waiting for us right around the corner. That is the issue I want to talk about. I also want to ask, I also want to look a little bit closer at the possible consequences of democracy for peace. On the one hand, we talked a little bit about that yesterday, so I'll be very brief there, but more about the consequences of democracy for economic growth and welfare. You know, many people would say, why bother about democracy if it doesn't bring benefits in terms of a better life, in terms of better economic and social and better conditions in every way for people. And I want to ask that question: is it really true that democracies bring those economic and welfare improvements And I can already disclose right now that there is both good news and bad news in that department. Okay. So let's get to it. I'm now at point 2 in my manuscript. You all got in my handout. So, measuring democracy is a tricky business. I will rely on the Freedom House annual index. Are you familiar with that? Okay, good. According to that, there were 42 free countries, democracies, in the world in 1976. In 2010, that number had increased to 89, while 58 countries are partly free and 47 are not free. Now, you know that we keep discussing about best ways of measuring democracy. And there has been a lot of criticism of the Freedom House Index. It's too subjective and it doesn't cover correctly, and there are a lot of internal consistency problems with it. The only thing I want to say about that is that there are a lot of problems with any other measure as well. And I think that at the end of the day, many people, when they are done criticizing Freedom House, they still rely on that index. Partly, I think, because every year it produces an update where for every country you can see, okay, what happened since last year. And you can, in relatively, I think, consistent terms, see what's going on. But of course, part of the discussion here is, or part of the complexity is that when we measure democracy, we immediately open up a discussion about what democracy is. And that very discussion is, of course, a very complicated one, because democracy can certainly be different things to different people. I rely on a straightforward liberal democratic conception of democracy, where it is a political system that has political participation, political competition, and political rights for people. But it has to have all three. Participation is not enough. As you know, in the old Soviet system, there was a lot of participation. And there were elections, and there were 99% participation. Looks very nice. But there was no competition, and there were no rights. So you have to have all three. And then again, I think the Freedom House measures that reasonably, in a reasonably nice way. So a substantial progress, even over those years, even if you still have 2.4 billion people that live in countries that are not democratic, and of course China weighs heavily into this picture. Point 3. This is impressive, but not entirely convincing, also because the number of countries in the world has increased from 147 to 195 during that period. More importantly, a large number of countries are in what we could call a gray zone. They are not fully democratic, nor completely authoritarian, but somewhere in between. They are either electoral democracies or they are electoral authoritarian systems. So you know that the Freedom House measure is a 1 to 7 measure. So average 1 is most democratic and average 7 is least democratic. And my point is that if you look at all the countries in the world, a fairly large number of them, close to 100 countries, are not fully democratic and not fully authoritarian, but are somewhere in between. Some of those in-betweens can be relatively close to the democratic end, but still not fully democratic. We might call them we might call them electoral democracies. Another group of these countries are towards the authoritarian end. We might call them electoral authoritarian systems. But you see, there are so many labels out there, or prefixes on democracy, exactly because there are so many countries in the gray zone. So what should we call them? Some call them illiberal democracies, some call them semi-democracies or pseudo-democracies or electoral, and so on and so forth. So there are a great many labels out there, but they indicate precisely that a very large number of countries in this world are not fully democratic, nor are they fully authoritarian, but they are in a gray zone between the two. On my last count, some of the countries that were electoral democracies are Argentina, Brazil, Bulgaria, Dominican Republic, Namibia, Romania, Botswana, India, Ecuador, Lesotho, Macedonia, Colombia, Philippines, and so on. And some of the more authoritarian systems are Burundi, Haiti, Morocco, Nigeria, Pakistan, Singapore, Thailand, Ivory Coast, Egypt, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mauritania, Oman, Qatar, Russia, Rwanda, and so on. So there are a lot of systems in there, in the gray zone, and that then leads to the next insight, that most of these countries in the gray zone are not necessarily in a transition towards more democracy. They are rather in what I would call a standstill. I mean, they sort of remain, perhaps not forever, but they seem to remain in a relatively stable way in what I call the gray zone. And that, of course, connects to what I said yesterday about there is no certainty of progress built into history. Things may not change for the better. History has no libretto. And maybe I should just briefly indicate can I use that board down there?
Sure.
Because this is connected to the fact that the process of democratization has different phases, and the countries, it is exactly the case with the countries in the gray zone that they remain in the early or the initial phases of democratization and don't reach towards the end. Now, this is a model I have stolen from a guy called Rostov. No, he's actually called Rostov. And he made it already in 1970. And he said, a process of democratization. Are you familiar with this model?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. You speak for everybody? Okay. But he says, I can be quick then. The process of democratization has one precondition, namely national unity. The people that are going to democratize have to agree that they want to be member of the same political community. If they don't want that, we have a problem. Like we have a problem in Kosovo, we have a problem in Sri Lanka, we have a problem elsewhere. We may have a problem in Iraq, because the Kurds do not want to be part of the political community with the Sunnis and the Shiites. So we might have a problem because of a lack of national unity, because then if national unity is lacking, a process of democratization becomes exceedingly complicated. Okay, but given that that is the case, the next phase is a breakdown of the authoritarian regime. A breakdown of the authoritarian regime. Then comes a, what shall I call that? In English, we could call it early democratization. And this is often accompanied by an election. And then comes consolidation, democratic consolidation, where democracy becomes, as people say, the only game in town. So the idea is that the countries in the grey zone have not reached this. They are somewhere in between here. And they might not proceed in that direction. They might as well proceed in this direction. It also gives another insight, namely that the breakdown of authoritarianism is not the same as a certainty that a democratic regime will be installed. Now we're waiting, the jury is still out on that in Egypt, right? Mr. Mubarak is down. In that way, there has been a big change because he was a dictator for 30 or more years. But there has not really been a change of regime form. The military still rules, huh? Will the military continue to rule? Or will it actually open up to something which is really more democratic? We're not quite sure of that, are we? This might still be some sort of reformed authoritarian system. And even if you come beyond this phase and go further in the democratization direction and have some form of free and fair election, you cannot be entirely sure that this will lead towards democratic consolidation. A lot of countries, as we just talked about, hold elections, and we cannot be entirely certain that they will always guarantee a continued development towards democracy. One of my favorite examples in this regard is the old dictator in the Ivory Coast, Mr. Houphouët Boigny. I don't know if you remember him, but he was also a ruler for many, many years. He's dead now, so we can talk badly about him. And in the early 1990s, Houphouët Boigny picked up the phone and called the opposition in his country and said, "You can come to a meeting in my office," and they came, and he said, "Well, now I want to hold the elections that you have requested for so long." And the opposition said, "Well, but we are not organized and we're not ready. We don't have any press. People don't know about us sufficiently yet, so we need time." And Houphouët Boigny said, "What? I promise you elections and you complain? Of course we hold the election, and my party, which everybody knows because it is signified by a cow, will surely compete with your party." And who won the election? Mr. Houphouët Boigny's party. And the election was even relatively free and fair. He also won the presidential election. And you see, we had a relatively free and fair election. But did we have a decisive step towards democratic consolidation? We did not. So we always have to evaluate what is going on behind the scenes and what is going on behind the formal events before we can really know what it is that is taking place. We talked a little bit yesterday about what might happen in China, And there is now a large debate on that. China is 0.5. China is capitalist today, but may not become a democracy. It may rather develop its own model. Russia may not become a democracy. And I think I keep repeating Mr. Berlin. It's probably because I'm so infatuated with that insight about history has no limit. But the Chinese system is no longer the stoically totalitarian system that it used to be. It's just, but what is it then? Some call it post-totalitarian, but it's surely not democratic, even if there are some local tendencies for democracy or for some democracy in some relationships. But then you have a system where the party has been very clever in being able to absorb new interest groups in society and, in a way, give them a voice within the Communist Party. As I think you may well know, some years ago it became possible for capitalists to become members of the Chinese Communist Party. I thought that was a great development, that Mr. Marx and Mr. Engels and all the others would surely be worried about this. But it is a sign of the capacity of the Chinese Communist Party to be able to absorb new interest groups and to some extent give them a voice within an authoritarian system which is still solidly controlled by the communists. And this is, of course, not democracy in any meaningful sense, but still it might be a relatively flexible and therefore in some ways a relatively more stable system than many of us think. And then some people will say, yeah, but with Chinese modernization and economic growth and all that, you have more education, more communication, internet, Twitter, Facebook, and you have people coming out and making demands, and all this is to some extent true, but it also relies on the idea that the rising middle classes in China are all dramatically in favor of democracy as we know it, and all against a more or less reformed authoritarian system. And I'm not sure at all that this is the case. I have a very good friend in China, in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a professor I've known for many years. He spent time in the United States. He's high up in the Chinese system. He spent some time in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution because he wanted to learn English via the Voice of America. That was not good. But when I speak to him today, he said, first he asks me, you have to explain to me what democracy is, because it puts so much emphasis on the individual. And in China, we put more emphasis on the state. That is, the notion of individual freedom is to some extent difficult to understand if you start with the Chinese tradition. And then his second point was, we shouldn't have your democracy because it's too unstable. Look at Indonesia. I mean, if you have democracies, you have all kinds of waves going up and down, and then you will not have solid and stable economic growth and development. And this is what we need first and foremost. So it might not be the case that you have a great demand on part of rising middle classes in China for democracy as we know it. Some people will then say, but China is then in a sort of catch-22, because the more economic growth and welfare improvement takes place, the less that will mean to most people, because they will then be satisfied and be ready to ask for other things that read democracy. and I can see it, but I don't think it has happened big time so far. So I think the jury is still out on that. So, point 6. Because I just talked about a pessimistic view of democracy and democratization, and I return to the issue that things may surprisingly also move in another direction. Today we are optimists on behalf of the Middle East, but where will those mobilizations end? If history is any guide, hardly in full-blown democracies for a number of reasons. And what I just briefly want, I can't spend a whole lot of time on this, but what I just briefly want to say there that we have countries where the vast majority of the population is under 30. And you have coalitions of young people like yourselves from all layers of society and middle classes, it seems to me, frustrated by deteriorating living conditions, and they were able to get together in Egypt, for instance, and in Tunisia, and quickly topple autocrats who had ruled for decades. But still, the final outcome is unclear. These are countries where the armed forces have long played a significant political role. I think I would even say in Egypt, for example, without the tacit and open support of the military, the movements could not have succeeded. Look at what happens in Libya when the armed forces go against the people. And at this point, as we talked about, regime change has not taken place. Mubarak has stepped down, but the country continues to be ruled by the military. I think the formation of a new regime is a longer-term process, and it'll certainly be subject to variation among countries because the preconditions are dissimilar. Some form, I think, of liberalized authoritarianism is more likely than full-blown democracy. It may be in the form of more discreet military rule, for example, in Egypt. If the protesters succeed in Libya, some form of tribal rule, or maybe some sort of liberalized regimes or liberalized monarchies elsewhere, with a strong role for Islamic parties. It's not quite certain where this will end. So, point 7. A basic insight. Sorry. Democratic opening is relatively easy. Democratic consolidation is much harder. Democratic openings can happen anywhere, also in very weak states, and this goes against the insights that have been sort of valid understanding of democratization for quite a while. I think they go back to the American sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset, who wrote a famous article where he said, the more well-to-do a nation, the more likely it is that it will sustain democracy and enter a process of democratization. And it is true that the conditions for democracy are better in wealthy countries, but it is not true, manifestly, that democratic openings can take place only there. And I think this is what we have learned in recent years, that democratic openings can happen anywhere, also in very weak states, Nepal, Sierra Leone, Liberia. Democratic consolidation, by contrast, is harder to achieve for a number of reasons. And we've touched upon some of those reasons because we talked about about the problems of weak statehood, but still, why has all these countries in the gray zone, why has democratic progress not been more substantial when we consider the fact that many people seem to want it, and we also consider the fact that there are no rival ideologies out there that can really be a serious rival to liberal democracy. And I think we have to consider a number of causes in this context. One, old vested holders of power are very hesitant to step down. You saw Mr. Mubarak, he didn't like it at all. You see Mr. Gaddafi, he doesn't like it at all. Rather to the contrary, they struggle to hold on to power with everything they have. Second, extreme poverty might not make democracy impossible, but it makes it more difficult. And I think you have, I'll return to that in a moment. You have a relatively well-functioning democratic system in India, but it's never been a really good democratic system, and extreme poverty is one of the problems in that regard. You also have, in many countries, very, very harsh inequalities. You have big, large groups that are relatively weak, and you have elite groups that are very dominant. That also is an impediment towards democratic consolidation. You have economic and political crises, and you have many countries where there is not really a democratic culture, where people are more used to take care of themselves and not to expect too much from the state anyways. Afghanistan is an example of that. So, democratic opening, relatively easy. Democratic consolidation, much harder. Point 8. The holding of elections may be a good sign, but it's not at all a guarantee that that stable democracy is underway. And we talked about that. I think I can leave it at that. Many countries with problems are weak or fragile states. They lack effective and responsive state institutions. They have defective economies, and frequently they have not developed national communities. A very different trajectory compared to the typical process of state formation in Europe. And we talked about weak statehood yesterday, so I think I can skip that in detail as well. I just want to say that the difficult phase of democratic consolidation, making democracy the only game in town, is difficult for several reasons. One reason is that many countries in the gray zone lack institutionalized, strong political parties. And without solidly institutionalized, strong political parties, many people feel that they are not really represented in the political system. The struggling democracies also, in a number of cases, lack legitimacy because the old structures of legitimacy are stronger than the new democratic structures of legitimacy. By the old structures, I mean you trust your tribe, you trust your ethnic group, or you trust, this is the charismatic legitimacy, of course, of Max Weber, or you trust this leader not as a representative of the system, but as a person. It's more or less personal rule. And that kind of legitimacy does not change very fast. It is more deeply rooted in societies. And that's part of the problem that we have in context of improving democracy in countries in the gray zone. Can external intervention solve the problem? Responsibilities to protect? In most cases, no. Too little, too late, too complicated. What I just want to say here is that that democracy promotion from Western countries such as my own has now really become a growth industry. And you have a lot of people spending a lot of resources and doing a lot of things in a large number of countries in order to strengthen civil societies, build up parties, strengthen women organizations, and holding free and fair elections, and so on and so forth. This is all very nice, but it comes back to the fact that the outsiders cannot do the job for them. It is the insiders that have to build democracy. The outsiders are going home again, and there are strong limits to what they can do. At the same time, I think we should recognize that even if Western countries conduct a lot of democracy promotion, they have also had more complicated agendas in the third world. Look at the current situation in the Middle East. I think that the immediate idea of many Western leaders when they saw what was happening to Mr. Mubarak was one of, okay, it's very nice that this country may become more democratic. But they also thought, well, yeah, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. I mean, we made business with him for many years, and who are we going to do business with now? I mean, we could trust him to keep the radical Muslims down, and we could trust him to do basically what we wanted him to do in context of Israel and the Palestinians and so on and so forth. This element is still there. I think also that Western countries have simply focused too much on elections. They have erroneously thought that if we have relatively free and fair elections, then we almost also have consolidated democracy. But this is simply not the case. And sometimes, Mozambique, for instance, a few years ago is an example, external donors will invest a lot of money and resources in a so-called Rolls-Royce election. You know, we spend a lot of money, we make sure that everything goes nicely, but this was not really, I mean, and then they all go home afterwards, and then the political system begins to function the way it used to. There has been too much focus on elections, and basically I also think that the so-called war on terror, in some cases, take Pakistan for instance, or take Saudi Arabia, security and other interests have meant that the West have been interested in working with dictators rather than working against dictators. So my overall conclusion on this part of my talk is that yes, we now have new hopes for what's going on in the Middle East, but we should not be overly optimistic, and we should not forget about the difficult and many times problematic structural conditions in many countries which inhibit a full process of democratization. And that means that we should expect countries in the close to 100 countries in the gray zone, most of them, I think we should expect to remain in the gray zone for quite a while. How are we doing on timing? No, not good. Right. So, let me move on. And let me turn from democracy itself to the possible consequences of democracy. Many argue, point 11, that democracy will bring both development and peace to the world. Do they have a point? Let's look at development first. Now, I speak on this subject with some hesitation because I spent some of the best years of my life studying it. And I wrote not my PhD, but the larger doctoral dissertation on the subject. And I wrote a book called Democracy, Dictatorship, and Development in the early 90s, which really ought to have been much better known than it is, but I recommend it if you can find it anywhere. It came out with Macmillan. Now, my great hope then, I was a little bit younger, was that I would sort out this problem about the relationship between forms of regime on the one hand and economic development on the other. And I would write up a law. I would like it to be called Georg's Law. And that would define precisely what was going on in this area, and the world would be wiser for it, and I would, of course, be famous. Anyways, it didn't turn out that way. Now, why? Because, as we have just talked about, democracy and authoritarianism, or dictatorship, if you want, are complex entities. Democracy in Lithuania is very different from democracy in India. Authoritarian rule in Vietnam or China are different from authoritarian rule in Libya or Saudi Arabia. So the point is that the form of regime is really a moving target. And there is no simple and uniform relationship between these moving targets on the one hand and economic development and welfare on the other. That's the short of it. No Georg's Law. So, I'm sorry to say. And of course there was an additional problem, and remains to be an additional problem here, namely that there are relatively few stable democracies in the third world. I mean, most democracies, as we talked about, are young and under construction. That makes it difficult to say how they will fare in terms of development and equalities. What should we say about all these countries in the gray zone? But still, we can say something. But the idea of an overall law and a fixed relationship, forget about it. But something we can say, because we do have a number of relatively, point 13, we do have a number of relatively stable democratic systems in the third world, and if we compare them with non-democracies, we find that in terms of economic growth, the democracies do fairly well, not exceedingly well, but reasonably well. They are in the mid-range with the annual growth rates of 3 to 7%. That is an investigation conducted by Atul Kohli of Princeton University, who has worked with this subject for quite a while as well, and who's an expert on India. Now, why do the democracies get these results? Well, if you have very high rates of growth, then they can only happen if you have authoritarian systems that set everything else aside, that really push for only growth, growth, and growth. China did that in some periods. Taiwan did that in some periods. South Korea, Brazil under dictatorship. But democracies cannot do that because they need to take other considerations into the picture as well, or the political pressure would increase on the rulers. Very low rates of growth create political turbulence in democracies. For instance, in India, therefore, democratic regimes want to maintain decent growth rates. So there is an explanation to why they are sort of in the middle range. Point 14. As regards redistribution and equality, the democracies are also doing relatively well, but not as well as we might expect. Take the case of India, a fairly stable democracy with a staggering 42% of the population below $1.25 a day. I don't know why I've written 350 here. It should be more than 500 million people. Why has democratic India not done more for welfare? I think this was one of the questions that was really puzzling for me in context of trying to understand what was going on here. If you have a relatively democratic country such as India, why do they continue to have these several hundred millions of very poor people? Now, the short answer is listed in the 3 points in point 14. There's a rhetorical welfare impulse. That means politicians speak a lot of welfare improvements and better conditions for the poor, but it loses force when it comes to real legislation and implementation. That is to say, they talk a lot about better conditions, especially during election campaigns, but they do much less when it comes to really making new laws and really implementing them. Implementation has a lot to do with this as well, and really implementing them in ways that actually do benefit the poorest people. And this is connected to the next point. Even in a democracy, elite dominance can continue. Now, there are 3 major elite groups in India: the rich farmers, the owners of industry, and the higher echelons of bureaucracy. Now, political measures going against the elite tend not to be successful. That is to say that within the democratic system, the alliance of elites is able to control politics and political measures in such a way that their interests are safeguarded. So political, as we all know, but it needs to be repeated here, political power can be concentrated even in democratic systems. And this is connected then to the third point. The poor are not well organized, and they have little political clout. They are divided in terms of caste and religion and so forth. Right. So the conclusion on this point is, before we move on, is that we cannot really expect great achievements in terms of welfare and equality improvement from elite-dominated democracies. And many of the frail democracies in the third world are elite-dominated. Some of them are not. Costa Rica, I think, would be an example of a more, we could call it a more social democratic system with a higher level of equality. But many systems, democratic systems in the developing world, are elite dominated. Now, what about the authoritarian systems? Now, in general, they do miserably bad, both in terms of growth and in terms of improvement in welfare and equality. Why? Well, basically because they are run by self-seeking elites that want to line their own pockets. These are the Gaddafis, the Mubaraks, the Mobutus, and what you have in a large number of countries. But a few authoritarian systems are highly effective when it comes to growth and welfare. China is an example, Taiwan and South Korea were examples in an earlier phase. Maybe Vietnam is a current example. What brings about these developmental dictatorships? Sorry about that. A combination, I think. What brings about? Why do we have a few authoritarian systems that do really well in terms of economic growth and are also capable of improving conditions for their populations? I think it must be explained by a combination of domestic and international forces. Now, in the domestic area, we have strong ideologies, we have programs, we have struggles for reform. Now, internationally, we have also in these systems have threats from the outside, so that these countries are compelled to keep their houses in order and to find public support. And in order to find public support, they need to deliver some measure of growth and welfare. That is my larger point here. Now let me give a couple of examples. Taiwan under Chiang Kai-Shek. I don't know if you know Chiang Kai-Shek. He was one of the worst rascals in history. He was really bad when he was a leader on the mainland. There are some stories about this. There was I forget the author, there's a great biography of Chiang Kai-Shek written about this. How could he then come to Taiwan and become the head of a regime that was successfully promoting economic growth, development, and welfare? Well, first of all, he knew that he had to gain some legitimacy on Taiwan, also among the Taiwanese, in order to have a place to be. So he had a domestic agenda. He also had an international agenda, because Mao was ready to come across the Taiwan Strait and eat him for breakfast. And the Americans, who were disgusted with him, even though they had supported him on the mainland, said to him, you need to put your house in order, you need to cut down on corruption, and you need to promote economic development, and we will help you with it, including agrarian reforms and a number of other reforms. But unless you do that, we will not support you. So there was a domestic and an international pressure to do something. So my hypothesis here is that authoritarian leaders can do good things provided they are under pressure. The South Koreans were under pressure. Mao was under pressure, also because he was sure that he was not good friends with the Soviet Union. He might have a conflict with the Americans, and they were very strong. He also needed the support of the Chinese. But a number of the dictators that we just talked about, the Mobutus and the Mubaraks and the Gaddafis, have not really been under pressure. They have been able to make deals with their potential, with those international, or with those outsiders that would potentially put them under pressure, because they had something to come up with. oil, keeping radical Islamists under control, and so on and so forth. They have not been under pressure domestically either. They have been able to pay off some of the groups that competed with them, and then they could spend the time filling their own pockets. So what I'm trying to say here is that so-called developmental dictatorships, authoritarian rulers who really end up doing good things, are rare occasions because they have to be under domestic and international pressure in order to deliver. Now, point 17. Even if there are developmental dictatorships, we should remember that democracy is a value in itself. I don't think I'm going to expand on that, but let me just say this. Let me just say this. The fact that authoritarian systems that are very powerful can end up doing good things should always be combined with the fact that when they are so powerful, they can also make terrible mistakes. And those terrible mistakes can have really serious consequences for the populations. Think of the Great Leap Forward, which was really a great leap backward in China, or think of the Cultural Revolution. I mean, you have phases. You have some phases in China where authoritarian leadership has really had dramatic consequences for negative consequences for the people. But then some people come and say, and Amartya Sen is one of them, and he says, yes, this is true. China has had these years of shame, but if you compare the overall success of China and see how much further they have got in terms of welfare improvement than India, then you will have to speculate that the structural conditions that we just talked about in India, the elite rule, really gives. India has not had great catastrophes, famines and so on. The system takes care of that. But day-to-day conditions in India are so poor, says Amartya Sen, that every 8 years India puts as many or more skeletons in its cupboard than China did in its years of shame, unquote. That is to say, we have to keep a perspective here. So, point 18, the bad news, no clear relationship between democracy on the one hand and growth and welfare on the other. The good news, most authoritarian systems fare even worse, and democracy is a value in itself. Now, I want to finish soon, so the issue in point 19 about democracy and peace, I think I covered that basically yesterday. What I wanted to talk about here is the difficulties that outsiders have in promoting good things in weak states, and I think we have covered that pretty well. So let me jump to a conclusion. I have spoken at length about democratic deficiencies in those countries that I have classified as countries in the gray zone and elsewhere. And I think we have to look through our own windows as well, and then see how democracy fares in our own part of the world, because you have to realize that democracy is a project that never ends. I mean, you can achieve certain things in political systems, but if you do not hold on to them, things can change, not only for the better, but also for the worse. Has it changed for the worse in our parts of the world? Well, yes and no. I think there's a certain apathy in many so-called developed, stable, consolidated democracies. I'm really worried about when I look at the Tea Party movement in the United States, and I ask, is this really a current expression of what political discussion looks like in a consolidated democracy? I'm worried about that. I'm also worried about the measures that are taken to nominally to protect us, but they can of course also go against some of the democratic gains. There has been a great discussion about the so-called anti-terror laws in the United Kingdom, also in my own countries, also in the United States. Have they gone too far? Do they resurrect surveillance of the population, control of the population in a way that is not really democratic, but reminds us about previous systems that perhaps you know better than I do? And finally, I think there are a number of democratic challenges that we have simply not responded to. And the biggest challenge is the fact that when we talk about democracy and democratization, we always assume that the entity that is going to democratize is a sovereign state. Democracy is something that takes place within the borders of a well-defined country. But we increasingly have a globalized world. We increasingly have very, very strong cooperation across borders, especially in the EU. Now, do we have good answers to the challenges that have to do with a democratic deficit in the EU? I'm not sure we do. What happens here is that the centers of power move further away, the bureaucratic element increases, the lack of transparency increases. These are many deals behind closed doors, and most seriously, I think, there is simply too little or almost nothing, or almost no debate across borders between peoples about how Europe should develop and what the European Union should really look like. And the major reason for that is that the theory about how we and the practice about how we develop democracy, not within a country, but across borders, is really not very well developed. And some people even think that this cannot be done for various reasons. I mean, how can we get a trans-border European public? We have to read the same paper and speak the same language. Should we all speak English? How should this really be solved? How can we increase transparency in such a way that, and how can we get to participate in deliberations that will make this more democratic? Others are much less skeptic. They claim that as long as we send representatives to Brussels and elsewhere with a democratic mandate, we can always change the democratic mandates and then make sure that this will all be nice and democratic. But sometimes I'm not so sure. So let me end then on the note that there are democratic challenges not only in the world at large, but also in our own countries. Thank you very much.
I'm a student at this university, and my question stems from your conclusion. As you said, we should look at your conclusion you've just made. So like you said, we should look through our own windows. So my question is actually about Denmark and Greenland. How do you see that, and what forces do you see behind this independence drive? And is it really independence drive, or is it only a way to achieve some goals? Thanks.
Denmark and Greenland?
Yeah. maybe Faroes if you want also, but Greenland for me is of particular interest, and then we also know that it's an Arctic region, so it's more important in my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. It sort of documents the number of different takes that we have on the debate about democracy and democratization, because around the world you actually have a number of countries or territories that are in a similar position. I mean, they are to a large extent they have home rule. In that sense they have democracy, but they are not totally independent, and they still have close ties with the so-called home country or mother country, or what you would say. And how does this process then play out? And in that context, my immediate idea would be that democracy becomes a more difficult game, because then it is exactly a demonstration of that it is not played only on the domestic scene. There are always the considerations for what will happen to the links we have. And the links, of course, they go both ways. Because on the one hand, you could say that there is home rule, as there is in Greenland. But there is, of course, also a dependency, because a solid part of the state expenditure of Greenland is sponsored by a check from Denmark. And a lot of the democratic discussion in Greenland is, of course, also to some extent focused on what if we do so and so, what will then happen to the subsidies we get, or the relations we have to those Danes down there in Copenhagen. And this is further complicated, I think, by the fact that there's probably a lot of oil in the Greenland waters, and they have already found some indication that there is a lot. And this is complicated in several ways, because the Danes also say this looks very nice. Oil, could we have some also? And the deal that then is made with Greenland is, well, if you find a whole lot, then what will happen is that the check you get from Denmark will gradually go down, because you get another source of income. But when it is down to zero, we have to renegotiate, which is really to say, then you can get full independence, because then you can afford it. So the larger issue here really is that if you have countries and territories like that, I just participated I recently participated in a conference in Copenhagen where you had representatives from a number of French and British dependencies around the world that are in somewhat similar situation. You know, they are dependent, they're not fully sovereign, they have some economic connections, and so on and so forth. And what this really does is that it complicates the democratic game, because it puts an outside player in there which potentially has a lot of power. But it also sort of conditions the local elites towards playing a game with the outsiders, which really is about how much can I get and how much should I really deliver in return. So for me, it really demonstrates what the additional complexities that democracy must be subjected to when you have a situation of a not fully sovereign country. I know I haven't answered your question completely, but it's a nice example of one of the complexities when we are across borders and we also have dependencies.
I'm a student of this university as well, and I have two questions. The first one is about the democratization project that is led by United States. Where should we put that in the scale of value and interest? I mean, is United States more building horizontal system or more vertical one with itself and on the top? And the second question is also about democratization. Why it happens that democracies feel that they need to impose democracy on other countries, democratic values? Is it in the democracy itself or more in the character of the countries that hold democracy?
There has, of course, been a lot of discussion of this over the years, because when very powerful countries go about doing things elsewhere, what is it really that they have in mind to do? And you could say that liberal democracies, and perhaps especially the United States, will almost always have not only one interest, which is about promoting democracy. I think that interest is there. It's fair enough. It would be better for the United States, it would be better for us, it would be better for the liberal democracies at large if the world in general was more democratic. In that sense, we are honest when we say that we want to promote democracy around the world. But we almost always have additional interests, and those additional interests might not always point in a democratic direction. Now, an early example of this involving the United States was during the Kennedy administration. And John Kennedy was going to make up his mind about whether he should support a democracy movement in the Dominican Republic. And the movement wanted to topple the dictator and wanted to install democracy. Looks very nice from as far as we can see. But Kennedy was worried. He was worried that this would not be democracy of the right kind. I mean, what if the Democrats were really socialists? What if they would install a Castro regime? So Kennedy concluded, yes, we would like to have democracy, but we cannot tolerate a Castro regime. So in order to avoid that worst case, I think we should go on supporting the dictator, which they did. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And you see, this was during the Cold War, but it was a clear example about that there might be limits to how far liberal democracies, especially the United States, will go in supporting democracy elsewhere. Now, today is a different world, but it's not a different world altogether. There are still ulterior motives. Recently, the United States had something that they called a war on terror. And if a war on terror was number one, and promoting democracy was number two, then the war on terror meant that we have to make good deals with the dictators in Pakistan. And we also have to have really good relationship with the dictators in Saudi Arabia, because they support us in the war on terror. Now, when this is all said and done, of course, we would also like democracy, but the other thing comes first. So I think this is a fact of the world. Liberal democracies want to support democracy, but they can also have ulterior motives. The good news is that in recent years there are fewer ulterior motives and more reasons for supporting democracy. So things have moved in the right direction. There's not the fear of socialism in Latin America than there used to be. The Americans supported Lula in Brazil together with the rest of us. So the traditional fear of communism is now, I think, a thing of the past. But I think you can always also be sure about another item, namely that the United States and other consolidated democracy do not support any kind of democracy whatsoever. They would like to support a special kind. Now, that special kind has a high degree of presence of private undertakers and private markets and a capitalist economic system. It needs to be democracy combined with capitalism. It should not be democracy which is, you see, too radicalized in ways that may be threatening American or Western values. You see the problems involved in supporting or not supporting the Islamic movements in Algeria. And you see the hesitations now. Can we support these people because they might become Islamists, and then what? And so you will always have these considerations about, I think, about how far we can go and how we should do it. So these are not, I think, these are not tensions that can sort of be speculated away. But if you ask me about the appropriate policies, I would say, yes, we have to support democracy movements. We have to support democracy movements even when they take measures we don't like. That's part of democracy. I mean, they decide. But if they take measures that go against democracy, that will suppress other groups, if the Islamists will not make other groups speak up, if they want something which is non-democracy, then we can fight against them on democracy's ground. But you see, it's a precarious path out there, and you will have different countries choosing differently because they make different priorities. If you really emphasize the war on terror, that will come first. This has already been taken a little bit, or quite a bit back, from Mr. Bush to Mr. Obama. So these things always change. And I think that if you look at the development since the end of the Cold War, things have actually changed for the better. And one of the good results of the recent uprisings in the Middle East has been that there is now more attention on countries, negative attention on countries that actually support dictators. So, you know, we are a little bit away from Mr. Putin as man of the year with his steely confidence and strength, and we are more towards, oh, so you are supporting this dictator and that dictator, why are you doing this? And I think that is an improvement for the better.
There is view that EU is more administrational structure than political structure, and there is a thought that the idea of EU is a revival of the old Rome Republic. So I want to ask a question. Is the driving force of EU is not the same as the old Rome Empire, that is expansion, and if should we to continue this expansion policy if we have such problems in European Union?
I think that many of us higher hopes for what the EU might become and might be as a player in the world, as a sort of stronger entity that could put the Americans in place, right? You see, there's not really been a party around for the last 20 years who could put the Americans in place. They have simply been too strong and too dominant. And many of us hoped that the EU would become such a player, and that close cooperation between EU countries would also mean that they would move more coherently to speak with one voice in the world. But to a large extent, I see we see testimonials every day to the fact that this has not happened. And I think I can only say that this it documents how difficult it is to build that kind of cooperation between strong countries that are used to conduct their own policies and have their own priorities in the world, such as the French or the Brits, and now increasingly also the Germans, but also to some extent the rest of us. Now, the good news is that this is slowly moving in the right direction. That under the surface of these very different views of what we should do here and there in Libya or wherever, where we can't really agree, there is a tendency towards increasing cooperation and coordination that I hope will become much stronger in coming years, because I would be happy to see the EU speak with a stronger voice in the world. I would hope it would be a more liberal democratic voice and a more clean voice than the American one, and I would like to see that. Now, about enlargement. Now, the first thing we have to say, I think, is that the example of the EU, I firmly believe, is an example of an external actor who has been able to powerfully affect the process of democratization in Eastern Europe. I think that is the case. Why? Because the EU had a price in the end. If countries became more democratic and if countries democratized in basic ways, they could become EU members. And I think that was a very powerful democratization incentive for a while. It doesn't work as well anymore, because once you get the prize, of course you have it, and you can start behaving in other ways. But I think it is an example of an organization which has then been able to powerfully affect a process of democratization in Eastern Europe, which has developed better than it otherwise would have had if the EU had not been there. If that's a controversial statement, you have to object. Now the big issue is, of course, how far can enlargement go, and what are the conditions that you must still have to live up to in order to become a member. And I don't have a firm opinion of this. You know that the acquis communautaire is now up to 65,000 pages. So there are really a number of things that new members have to accept and go through before they can become full members. But I do not have a vision of fast expansion, and I do not have a vision of the exact opposite. I belong to those people that would hope that eventually democratization would develop in such a way in, for instance, Turkey, that it could become a member. But some people think that this is the EU developing out of Europe, and that is problematic. And I don't see that as a problem, provided that the democratic conditions are met. I realize this was not a clear answer, but I think it reflects some of the fuzziness in my own mind about this issue.